Good afternoon, folks. My name is Bill Gelineau, and I'm seeking the nomination of the Libertarian Party of Michigan to be governor of the state. So I'm speaking to you today mostly because I want the people who are watching the Facebook live event for Bridge Magazine to have an opportunity to hear a little more about the issues that we're going to talk about. Those events go really fast, and we're covering a lot of detailed information. So I hope you'll bear with me and spend a little time listening to what I have and maybe going to my website, which is cometogethermichigan.org, where a lot of these issues are covered in a lot more detail. I wanted to be sure, depending on what those questions are, when we have that event on the 12th, that you have the opportunity to hear about these issues, which I think are the most important things that we need to discuss. Certainly there's a lot of other issues, and we may be covering some of them as well. And I'm certainly open to any questions that anyone listening to our presentation wishes to have answered. You can email me at campaign@liberty4gov, that's the number 4, gov.org. Or you can just go to my website and there's a link there and you can email the campaign with any question that you might have. I want to start with talking a little bit about the Libertarian Party and how we got on the ballot and where we are now. I was chairman of the Libertarian Party during 2016 when Governor Gary Johnson ran for president of the United States and qualified us as a major party in the state of Michigan for the first time. And this is interesting and kind of fun because it's only happened 6 times that a party that was not a Democrat or Republican had an opportunity to be in the primary. And so Libertarians who have been growing throughout Michigan, we've been a party since 1972 in Michigan. We've grown and we hope to maintain our status as a major party and eventually become a viable third-party choice for the citizens of Michigan. That's the main reason I got into this race, is that we've seen a dysfunction in government over the last 20 years where more and more Democrats and Republicans often don't even disagree except with each other. And the consensus items and the things that are important for the citizens of Michigan have been ignored. I sought to use this opportunity to get into the race to talk about those things that I think are important and to talk to you directly about them. And again, our opportunities to get connected in the media have been minimal, and I hope that you might do something about that by talking to your local TV and radio stations and have them invite me on. I'd like to talk in depth about what these things are and to give you a real choice this fall. But right now I'm focused on the primary, which is on August 7th. And if you're not registered to vote, I hope you'll get registered and I hope you'll consider voting in the Libertarian primary. I do have an opponent. You're going to be introduced to him during the Bridge Facebook event. His name is John Tater. He has a website. I hope you might check that out as well. You certainly can compare us, and I hope to earn your vote. So one of the big things that I felt has been important to talk about is that the Republican Party in particular talks a lot about smaller government. And there's always a disagreement about what things to spend money on, what things not to spend money on. One of the things that I've noticed over the last few years is that there's an increasing gap between our spending limit for the state of Michigan called the Headley cap, which is found in Article 9, Section 26 of the Michigan Constitution. And this is an absolute income cap that has been established since 1978 when former activist and gubernatorial candidate himself, Dick Headley, managed to pass an amendment that has been one of the most important pieces of legislation that has affected the way our government runs. Our current spending is about $10 billion below that limit. And so often when we get into conversations about how we're going to spend money in the state, I think it's important to recognize that we're not going to become a high spending state again. And the best way to ensure that is to drop that cap. And that has actually become the mantra of my campaign. You may be seeing on cars driving around the state hundreds of little stickers that say drop the cap. And the Drop the Cap campaign has become easily recognized as essential to telling our citizens that, and just as importantly, everyone else, that Michigan does not wish to become a high spending state ever again. This is a big signal to the business community in particular that they can invest in the state without the fear that we're going to have extraordinary taxes enacted to really make operating in Michigan more difficult. And it's also kind of clean in that by doing this particular thing, we don't have to have an argument over how the money is spent. Under my proposal, which would drop the Headley cap from what it's currently at, which is 9.49%, down to 8.55%. And that's simply what the new ceiling would be, is at 8.55% of personal income. Right now, our current budget is about 8.1. So if anybody tells you this is a radical proposal, they're wrong. You know, the fact is that it would still leave about $5 billion on the upside should we have extraordinary income come in because of our growth in our economy and opportunities along those lines. Without changing anything, there's still a lot of room on the upside. Let me tell you just how much. Our current budget, which has been exploding recently, is up to $56 billion plus for fiscal year 18. And the discretionary budget, though, the part that really what Lansing decides, is a little over $10 billion. So with a $5 billion gap available, that would mean an increase in those ordinary taxes that are involved with what Lansing manages of an extraordinary nature. So don't let them scare you. Dropping the cap is not a radical proposal. It's an important proposal. And the reason it's important is it's going to speak directly to the business community, and it's also going to speak directly to the legislature. It's going to say, get your priorities in order, because we can't afford to go back to being the high spending state that we were back in the 70s and 80s. So I want to talk about other things today, but certainly I encourage you to learn more about the drop the cap. And by the way, that would be a constitutional amendment which would help lock in a procedure to help prevent having this excessive spending in Michigan ever again. But I would encourage you to also read section 27 that Mr. Headley put in the proposal that he passed in 1978. And that's the out clause that says that if the legislature comes together and they pass an emergency spending, that they're permitted to do that to exceed the cap. So this isn't something that locks us in such a way that we wouldn't have any flexibility whatsoever. But it does set some guardrails to help make sure that our future government is deciding what we want to be as a state. So the next thing that I want to talk about that I feel is an important part of my candidacy as a candidate is about legalization of marijuana. This has become sort of a cause célèbre recently, and more recently, the Democratic Party has latched onto that as something that's popular, and many of the candidates in the Democratic Party have now endorsed it. And it's so popular that the Republican-controlled legislature considered passing it through the legislature instead of allowing you to vote in November. And politics aside, I think there's a pretty broad consensus that recreational or regular use marijuana should be legalized. I want to say that the parties are a little cynical in this, in that they're against it until they realize that it might not be popular. In fact, many of the Democrats were against it until it became more popular. The Libertarian Party has been for the liberalization of legalized marijuana since our inception. We understand that this is what we call a natural right. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I consider myself along the lines of Gary Johnson, the former governor of New Mexico, in terms of his explanation of what the Libertarian Party is. You know, natural rights, as talked about in our Declaration of Independence, are inalienable rights. These are the things that are given to us naturally, and they don't require the permission of the government to do. I would put gun ownership in the same category. This is the kind of thing that you have the right to do to protect your family, or to be left alone while enjoying marijuana in your home, or alcohol, or anything else that adults are permitted to use in Michigan. This is a firm belief of the Libertarian Party that these rights are not granted by government, that government is instituted to ensure that we're able to have our rights. And I believe that the role of the government is not to penalize people for appropriate use of substances such as these, but instead to protect your right to use them. And I'm going to work as I did when medical marijuana passed in 2008. I'm going to work very hard to pass that this year. I think it's important. Now, one thing that distinguishes me from the main proposal that's out there is I don't believe in all these additional taxes that are put on, the excise taxes. There will certainly be additional income that's going to result as a function of marijuana becoming more legal. But I don't believe we should look at this as a money-grabbing opportunity. So that may distinguish me from both parties in that I'm actually in favor of removing all the laws that have penalized people for marijuana. So I'm going to move on. The third thing that I think is really important that you know about me is that I'm against any kind of spending for corporations that are profitable or future businesses or anything like that. A lot of people don't know about something called the Michigan Strategic Fund. The Michigan Strategic Fund sponsors such things as Pure Michigan, which I think is pure BS. Pure Michigan ought to be funded by businesses that want to attract people to come to their communities. And it isn't something that the government and their ordinary taxpayers and people that are struggling to pay their bills should be paying any taxes to support. In fact, there's pretty good argument that it hasn't been terribly successful, that the number of jobs in that tourism and recreation sector have not gone up significantly in 10 years. So I think it's time we reevaluate some of those programs, and in particular, other things that are in the strategic fund. The earliest example I can think of that is the Pontiac Silverdome, which a lot of us went on to believe was a big boondoggle and was, of course, recently destroyed. There are any number of other projects that the state sponsors and puts millions and millions of taxpayer dollars into, often for very narrow interests. Ordinary taxpayers shouldn't be supporting these things. If the Chamber of Commerce, businesses in a community, they want to have these kinds of activities, they should raise the money to do them. So those are the three main areas that I'm really pushing and wanting to talk about, and I really look forward to engaging in a conversation with you about them. There are other important items, and I want to touch on three of them right now. First and foremost, my opponent is concerned about the use of smart meters by the utility industry. And he's projected all kinds of concerns that the utility industry is out to control people and get their information. It's sort of conspiratorial thinking. I'd like to believe that the Libertarian Party, as it's grown, has gotten away from thinking that way, that it's always somebody trying to figure out things. In fact, a lot of the criticisms of smart meters, in my mind, have been shown to be false. The American Cancer Society, for example, has come out to say that they don't represent a health risk to Americans. What I would say is that if the Michigan Public Service Commission gave a different category for folks that want to voluntarily say, I want the old kind of meter, and that's a different cost, and it may be a little bit more expensive for the utility industry to have those put back in place. I'm all for voluntary choice in that matter, but I think most of us, we want smart meters. In fact, I want really smart meters. And I hope you'll go look at my environmental policy that's posted on my website. One of the things that I'd like to see us have the opportunity to do is be small business people and entrepreneurs who can not only generate electricity in a clean and responsible manner, but can sell it back to the net. And that requires the kind of technology where it can actually understand what's coming in and going out of that meter. So I'm not just for smart meters, I'm for really smart meters. And I don't believe in the conspiratorial theories that they're trying to figure out, how much is being used by your refrigerator or the Internet of Everything. It's simply a modern device to make electrical measurement more efficient, and it's nothing more than that. The second thing I want to speak to you about is something that hasn't gotten a lot of conversation. I'm in favor of having a proposal come through the legislature to pass death with dignity. Some people call this, remember back in the day when Jack Kevorkian and others were involved in assisted suicide. I think that's a distortion of this issue. But I do think it's time that we come back and talk about it. Other states around the country have passed death with dignity laws. I think as a mature population, we need to start thinking about how people might make individual choices. And this is not to suggest that anyone should be mandated by government to do any such thing. But I want to speak to the natural right of individuals to make that decision for themselves when they're terminally ill, that they have the opportunity to do that in a dignified way. These are always difficult conversations. And again, if you have any questions, I hope you'll email me and I'll be happy to talk about that. The last thing that I want to speak about is something that I think I'm the only candidate, maybe almost across the country, that has talked about this, and that is the use of the Michigan National Guard. If you Google my last name and the words National Guard, we're going to be right up there in the top of that. And the reason is that there's another young man whose name was Gelineau. His first name was Christopher, who was a distant cousin of mine, who was one of the first people killed in the Iraqi War. And he was a member of the New Hampshire National Guard. And the period of time from 2001 until very recently, I was involved in my business practice where I had the responsibility to have the flag raised and lowered outside of our business. I'm no longer in that position, but when I was, rather than delegate that to someone else, I made it a personal thing to do. And it was very important to me that when someone from Michigan's name was announced that they had been killed in Iraq or Afghanistan, that I would personally lower and raise that flag. And it certainly impacted the way I think about this. So I did some research, and it turns out that the Military Authorization Act of 2008 restored certain responsibilities and rights of governors. And I would point you to U.S. Code 10, Section 12301. And what's important about that is that short of the Congress enacting a declaration of war or an emergency declaration for civil purposes, that the President of the United States does not have the right to take control of the Michigan National Guard. I think I'm the only candidate who has stood up and said that he will fight any president, Democrat, Republican, or otherwise, that uses the National Guard without such permission. What that means is that all of the National Guard troops that have served in the last 17 years in these undeclared conflicts have done so with the permission of our governors, Republican and Democrat, who have not stood against the president for such misuse. That would include sending them to the border of the United States to work as a police force. I will oppose that. And I only know of one other governor in Oregon who has stood up and said the same thing. This is an important issue. We've had an awful lot of sacrifice of our men and women, and beyond those that have been killed, the number that have been injured in that service. I would do everything I can as governor to prevent the federalization of our National Guard without such a declaration. And I believe that the citizens of Michigan will stand with me on that as an important principle. Appreciate your time. It's been a good opportunity for me to talk to you directly about these things. I'm certainly going to do more of them in anticipation of the August 7th primary. Get registered. I'm looking forward. I hope I can get your support. I'll certainly answer your questions. We're going to have a lot more of these, and I appreciate it if you go to my website, cometogethermichigan.org. And again, you can always email me at campaign@liberty4gov.org. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to, and I hope to get your support.